Well, what is the state of the French government as it stands today? Two words answer that question: fiscal emergency. As yields rise in France, they will do likewise in Germany, in Italy, and across the Atlantic in the United States and Canada as well. In response to this, average Frenchmen, average Germans, etc., are likely going to renationalize in the process when it is time to move the French storm, and the rest of Europe typically follows. Welcome back to Men and the City. In today's video, we're going to talk about the collapse of the Fifth Republic and the fate of Europe. Well, the persistent theme in French politics in recent years has been that of instability, chaos, and frustration. Well, it seems this discontent has finally come to a head. This past week, Michel Barnier, the French Prime Minister and representative of the wildly unpopular coalition government led by President EmmanuelMacron, was ousted. Socialists on the left, led by Popular Front, and socialists on the right, led by the National Rally, categorically reject any fiscal adjustments or structural reforms whatsoever to the French welfare state, the largest and most indebted welfare state in Europe. Now, in response to this, President Macron gave a speech indicating that despite the collapse of his government, he will stay in office and will not resign until his term is up in 2 years' time.
Et hier donc, le gouvernement a été censuré. Et cela, malgré les concessions faites par Michel Barnier à l'ensemble des groupes parlementaires. Il a été censuré, ce qui est inédit depuis 60 ans, parce que l'extrême droite et l'extrême gauche se sont unis dans un front anti-républicain et parce que des forces qui hier encore gouvernaient la France ont choisi de les aider. Le mandat que vous m'avez démocratiquement confié est un mandat de 5 ans et je l'exercerai pleinement jusqu'à son terme.
Well, what is the state of the French government as it stands today? Two words answer that question: fiscal emergency.
Since the pandemic in 2020, that public deficit has really ballooned much higher than the European target, which is of 3% of GDP. And this year, it's actually expected to reach a 6.1%.
The state of the French budget today virtually mirrors that of Greece in 2012, at the height of the pig's meltdown that nearly brought the European Union down by itself.
10 years ago, Greece unveiled a black hole in the nation's finances, a budget deficit twice as big as expected. A flood of downgrades followed, then an unprecedented debt restructuring. And it didn't stop at Greece. It was just the first of 5 euro area nations to be bailed out, calling into question the very fabric of the single currency.
Its debt to GDP ratio is at 110%. That's double that of Germany at 60%. Its fiscal deficit is 6% of GDP, wildly exceeding European mandates. Now, compounding these issues is a long-standing decline in the French economy, high inflationary costs, mass migration, and a general collapse in the standard of living for average Frenchmen. This on the heels of successive waves of protest movements that began in earnest in 2018 with the rise of the Yellow Vest movement. Well, how did we get here? What does this mean for France and Europe? And what are the broader implications for the Western world? That is the subject of today's video. It's worth remembering that Austrian statesman and architect of the Congress of Vienna, von Metternich, once said that if France sneezes, Europe catches cold. Such a statement is as true today as it was since the days of Napoleon. To understand the instability of the republics in France's recent history, we have to go back to the French Revolution of 1789. The First Republic saw the rise of Robespierre, the Jacobins, and the Reign of Terror, and that only ended with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte as Emperor of the French in 1804. The next republic saw a similar fate, lasting from 1848 until 1852, when Napoleon III declared himself king And that lasted more or less until the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, when the Third Republic kicked off, which lasted again until World War II. However, between 1870 and 1940, there were some 107 governments that turned over in that time. That's roughly 2 governments a year. The Fourth Republic came about in 1946 and lasted until 1958, and its fate was more or less the same, seeing about 21 governments in the span of 12 years. However, the Fifth Republic was different. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said that every institution is the length and shadow of one man, and that's also true of governments. In the case of the Fifth Republic, that shadow is Charles de Gaulle. And Charles de Gaulle insisted that there be more executive power concentrated in the hands of the president to stabilize what had previously been a very unstable parliamentary rule in France's recent history.
Due to the powers afforded the French president under the Constitution of the Fifth Republic, some have dubbed this system a republican monarchy, and the French presidency has been described as one of the most powerful offices in the democratic world.
And more or less it worked. But de Gaulle brought something else to the table. He was a sovereign nationalist who was ever skeptical of a broader European internationalist project, which he viewed as the product of an Atlanticist union between the elites of the United Kingdom and the United States, who sought to supersede the interests of France as a sovereign national entity. As such, he was ever resistant to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and to broader international institutions in the European community. Well, in successive decades, the precedent of de Gaulle has been lost, and the governments that have succeeded him have basically been replaced by internationalists that have subsumed the interests of average Frenchmen within broader international institutions, the very thing that de Gaulle opposed. That being said, average Frenchmen and their views more or less mirror that of Charles de Gaulle and have only gained in momentum in recent years as France's sovereign interests, like that of Germany and Italy and other countries in Europe, have been violated by internationalist or globalist elites. This gets us back to the history of the French Revolution and unstable republics that have followed. Basically, the French Revolution gave us the left-right continuum, but the right on that continuum has completely collapsed. There are no sovereign nationalist parties of any merit in France, and those that exist in the European continent, while they're gaining momentum, basically have no sway whatsoever in the governance of their own countries, having subordinated themselves to the European Union, the European Central Bank, and other international institutions and interests. However, the budgetary meltdown in France today threatens to undo all of that.
This voice, I call it the fourth voice in the French parliament. You know, we have 3 blocks, center, far right, and the left, and I think the fourth voice now is going to be the bond market.
Because Western governments, from Germany to Italy to France and the United States and Canada, are structurally bankrupt, France's effort to flout any attempt to get control of its insolvency threatened to cause a cascading effect. Think about it as interest rates spreading like a virus. As yields rise in France, they will do likewise in Germany, in Italy, and across the Atlantic in the United States and Canada as well. Essentially, we are facing a kind of sovereign default crisis that spreads like a contagion. What that means is that the European Union itself as a project is likely to succumb to these budgetary upheavals and explosions. In response to this, average Frenchmen, average Germans, etc., are likely going to renationalize in the process, and you are going to see new movements, new parties centered in young men who have borne the brunt of mismanagement and economic decline and racial cultural friction brought upon by globalist elites in Europe. Effectively, the left-right paradigm has completely broken and been replaced by a conflict between globalist elites that run all of these institutions, national and international, and the people themselves, who are not populists as much as nationalists. A history of France shows that when republics collapse, it's usually because of some geopolitical conflict or war, or because of the rise of a strongman. It is likely the case that we're going to see both, and that will cascade to the rest of Europe when it is time to move the French storm, and the rest of Europe typically follows. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.